Everyone, we're building a gravel bike today, from scratch. Well, from the frame up anyways. Now this is the new Winspace G2 Gravel frame set that I have here, and in this mini-series I'll walk you through the entire process of building it up from a frame and a pile of parts to a complete bike as a home mechanic, and hopefully give you the confidence to build your own bike from the frame up as well. Or if not, just hang out and watch the process from start to finish. Now I should also mention up front that the frame set was generously sent over to the channel from Winspace, and some of the components on this bike were graciously sent over from my friends at Ritchey Design. Again, I really can't stress how thankful I am for their support and for taking a chance on a small channel like this. So when you build a bike from the frame up, it's true that the most important and perhaps most time-consuming part is actually speccing all the components that'll go on it. Now this is actually supposed to be the fun part, as your choice of components in large part dictates the purpose or style of the bike. However, with so many different standards for bike components, it can get overwhelming, as it seems like for any given part there are dozens of different standards and options available, and of course most aren't compatible with each other. Now if I tried to cover every possible standard for every possible bike component, this video would likely be obsolete before I even finished it, because new standards would have already come out in the meantime. Anyways, so in this mini-series I'll do my best to offer some big picture stuff, like the main differences between currently available standards, while also trying to make it a useful how-to. I know, it's ambitious, but let's just see how it goes. So first, with any new build, you'll want to just get the frame up in the stand. Now some carbon grip paste is a good idea for carbon-to-carbon interfaces to improve friction between parts and to avoid slippage. Now generally I use carbon grip paste if it's a carbon-to-carbon interface or a carbon to any metal interface. Now if it's metal to metal, then of course use grease. No need to worry about final torque specs at this point. Now for this frame, because I want to run the cables internally, I prefer to handle all the routing right up front, even before installing the bottom bracket and the fork. This will give me the most options as far as accessing the frame's interior if necessary. Now I don't have the fancy Park Tool internal cable routing tool, but I was able to route all the cables internally without too much swearing. The biggest challenge, of course, was running the rear hydraulic brake hose, which has to navigate the bottom bracket area and the skinny chainstay area. Now a long shift cable was the real hero here, as it's relatively easy to route through the frame, and it acts as a guide so you can pull the much larger diameter brake hose all the way through. Now the shift cables, on the other hand, should actually have been really easy. On this frame it's not full housing all the way through, but instead it's got plastic cable guides that are pre-run through the frame. So in theory, all you'd have to do is cut bits of housing at both the shifter and derailleur ends, and then run the inner shift cable through. However, when I was setting up this frame, I noticed that the inner cable guides were actually reversed from how I prefer to run cables. In other words, I prefer the rear shift cable, which starts at the right-hand drifter, to enter the frame on the left side of the down tube, and vice versa. It just makes the cable runs more natural and a bit cleaner in my opinion. So fixing this actually took quite a bit of time and involved pulling off the pre-installed frame doors and swapping the inner cable guides from left to right. Now this was actually kind of tough because the cable guides were flared at the ends so that they don't fall through the access doors, and I couldn't pull them too far out either, as I'd risk losing the other end inside the frame. Anyways, once this was all sorted out, it was a little bit smoother sailing. Now for me, since I'm extra paranoid about rattles and strange noises in the frame, I took this as an opportunity to run this housing damping from Jaguar. It's basically just foam hose that surrounds the housing inside the frame and prevents annoying rattles. Now I do have to admit that it's pretty overpriced in my opinion, and there are plenty of DIY options to consider, but for me, in some instances like cable rattling inside of a frame, I'm just not willing to take any chances. Now with the cables and internal lines all sorted out, up next is to temporarily install the fork, stem, and handlebars so we can install the drifters and start on the brakes. Now the headset for this frame is a pretty typical cartridge style headset from FSA, and what's even better is that the fork includes an integrated crown race, meaning that the lower cartridge bearing sits right on the fork crown and no crown race installer is required. Now by contrast, if your fork doesn't have this, then you need to use a crown race installer, which evenly presses the crown race onto the fork crown. It's not too complicated, but it's an extra step nonetheless, and I'm glad that this fork here has an integrated one. A bit of carbon-safe grease is usually a good idea on these parts, on top and bottom. Now at the top, the conical compression ring will follow the upper bearing, then a headset spacer and a temporary placeholder stem and handlebars will allow us to mount the drifters. Now normally you just mount the stem and bars that you'll be using, but I was actually waiting for a shipment from my friends over at Ritchey Design, who are supplying this new 70mm Toyon stem and a set of my favorite WCS Venture Max handlebars in 42 centimeters for this build. Thanks, Fergus. Now at this point we can slide the drifters on and install the hydraulic brake hose. Now the best practice for installing brake lines requires a clean cut on the brake housing using a dedicated housing cutter. Then you need what's called an olive and a barb to finish the cut end. The caliper or the lever lock bolt should go on first, then an olive, and then the barb will fit into the end of the housing. Now the idea here, of course, is that when you tighten the screw down, it will actually crush the olive and create a tight seal required for the high brake fluid pressures in the system. Now the barb inside the housing is alloy, so it prevents the whole cable from collapsing under the force of the crushed olive. Now installing the barb is easily done by smacking it in with a small hammer, but I actually prefer a more controlled approach with a tiny press like this one from Amazon. Now this here is Shimano BH90 housing, which is actually an update from the former BH59 housing and actually requires a different olive, so keep that in mind when replacing brake lines. 5 to 6 Newton meters on the locking bolt is what's needed at both ends, and the only truly correct way to do this is with an 8mm crow's foot attached to a torque wrench. Although I have gotten away with just using an open-end wrench in the past, I figure though for a few bucks for a new crow's foot, why take any chances on the critical braking system? Now with the brake lines all secure, it's time for a full bleed. Now there's no better video on the internet than Calvin Jones's Park Tool Shimano bleed procedure, so I'm not going to try and replicate that here. In summary, the process is similar for many brake systems, and it involves pushing fresh brake fluid up through the caliper, the brake line, and to the lever. Use mineral oil for Shimano brakes and the more volatile dot fluid for SRAM brakes. Now essentially every step in the process is aimed at clearing the lines of all air bubbles, which will result in poor braking performance if left unpurged. Now once you're done with this process, the lever feel should be really nice. The right amount of free stroke and a firm lever feel. Now with the internal lines all run and the hydraulic brakes bled, most of the tricky bits are actually done, believe it or not. Now at this point I'm comfortable installing the bottom bracket and cranks and moving forward with the build, knowing that I won't need to reach a screwdriver or a pick in there to move any cables around. However, I'm actually going to break here and split this build into 2 videos just so it doesn't drone on for too long. 20 minutes straight of me talking is not something that I'd wish upon you. So take a break, ponder your own bike build, and if you'd like, you can pick up right where we left off in part 2 of 2 right up here, or you can click the link down in the description whenever you're ready. Hope to see you in the next one.